Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for a cozy little event with Jennifer Steil and Alex George. Um, Jennifer Steil is the author of two previous books, The Woman Who Fell from the Sky, a memoir of her experience as a journalist in Yemen, and The Ambassador's Wife, a novel about a hostage crisis that was also inspired by Steil's own experience. And of course, the book that we're fetching right now. She currently lives in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, where it's 4:30 in the morning with her husband and daughter. And Alex George is a native of England. He read law at Oxford University, worked as a corporate attorney in London and Paris for 8 years. He now lives in Columbia, Missouri. He is the founder and director of the Unbound Book Festival and the owner of Skylark Bookshop in downtown Columbia. He has published 7 novels, which have been translated into 10 languages. His sixth, Setting Free the Kites, won the Missouri Award for Fiction in 2018. His most recent, The Paris Hours, was released in May 2020. It was a Book of the Month club pick and a national bestseller. In addition to his novels, Alex's writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Literary Hub, and numerous other publications. And here's the kicker. He still practices law in his spare time. And so those are our wonderful panelists, folks in conversation. I'm Christy, I'm a bookseller at Belmont Books. And yeah, thank you all for being here. I will turn it over to Jennifer and Alex.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Hi, Jennifer. It's nice to I know we did one event, didn't we, a while ago?
Yeah, I think it was last summer.
Yeah.
But our books are The Paris Hours and Exile Music, I believe, came out on exactly the same day.
Oh, they did. Okay.
A brilliant time during the pandemic for books to come out.
Yeah, it was interesting because I was saying, well, because it was May the 5th, and I had a 2-week national tour that was cancelled and did some Zoom events, but and we had planned or always imagined, let me say, that we were going to have a big party in the bookshop, and of course none of that happened. But I consoled myself with the thought, well, when the paperback comes out, all this will be done with, and we'll be able to have the party then. And here we are, paperback is out, and still no party.
Next book. For the next book.
Because that's the only reason why I write, is for the launch party. It's the only thing. So anyway, let's talk about, I mean, this beautiful book of yours, Exile Music, which I just adored. I gobbled it up and loved it so much, and I can't wait to talk to you about it. But I think what we sort of talked about was that, to begin with, you'll read a little bit from your book, and then I'll read a little bit from mine, and then I've got a ton of questions to ask you. So why do you want to begin by explaining the sort of origin story of the book, and then do your reading?
Sure. Great. And I can't wait to hear a bit of The Paris Hours as well, which I loved, which is a brilliant book. So you're all in for a treat. I will read just a very brief section of this, but just as an introduction, Exile Music is the story of a family of Austrian musicians from Vienna who flee the Nazis. They're Jewish Austrian musicians who flee the Nazis for the Andes of Bolivia. Bolivia is one of only 3 countries by 1938 still offering visas to Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis. So it wasn't really much of a choice. It was the only place that let them in. And so I discovered this story when I was living in Bolivia. I lived in Bolivia for 4 years. And early on in our time in Bolivia, my husband came home from a meeting with the Austrian honorary consul and said, "Did you know there are around 20,000 Jewish refugees living here during World War II?" And I hadn't known that. I had read a lot about Jewish refugees in other parts of South America, in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Venezuela, but I didn't know anything about that part of the diaspora that ended up in Bolivia. So I looked around for books, and there's some lovely memoirs about it, but pretty much no fiction in English that I could find. There's a wonderful memoir by Leo Spitzer called Hotel Bolivia. And the title comes from the fact that a lot of the Jewish refugees who fled there didn't intend to stay. It was a hotel to basically wait out the war before they could move on to the US or elsewhere in South America or Israel. La Paz, Bolivia is at 12,000 feet or 4,000 meters, depending on how you measure things. And it's quite difficult to live at that altitude. And that alone is challenging, let alone like if you've just come from Nazi-occupied Austria and you've lost everyone you love and your profession and your ability to support yourself and your money and everything. And you're in this strange place and having to adapt to a new culture and a new language, and the altitude. I started imagining what that must have been like. So that was the first seeds of this story. And very shortly thereafter, I met some of these survivors who maybe I could talk about later. But anyway, so much of the book takes place in Bolivia. It starts in Austria, to give you a sense of what their life was like before they left, and then ends up in Bolivia, with them figuring out how to start their lives all over again. So I'm just going to read you a page and a half from the overture. The book is follows the shape of Mahler's Third Symphony. So there are 6 movements. Hard to find a symphony with 6 movements, but there is one, thankfully. Okay. When I think of Austria, I remember what a child remembers. Details as vivid as the bright shards of a dream. The coffee-warmed air of the kitchen, the rough fabric of my father's suits against my cheek, the chalk dust of my classroom tickling my nose, the ice-crusted snow in the meadow that cut my eyebrow open when I fell off the toboggan halfway down the slope. My Annalisa. My parents' voices in the kitchen as I hovered, still and silent, by the door, secretly listening. It was important then to listen. I remember the tang of my mother's apricot jam spread over a thick layer of butter on crusty bread, the fungal stink of my older brother's dirty sports clothing on the bathroom floor, the earthy scent of the square olive oil soap that was always slipping into the sink. I remember a plum tree in our small communal courtyard that dropped its sour sweet fruit onto our terrace. They were a dark dusty purple, more oval than the green ones we'd eat in Bolivia. In Vienna, Annalisa's mother collected the dropped fruits and used them to make torts. I remember my mother's voice in our parlor, starting off low and gathering the energy to soar. I remember the scent of rosin on horsehair, the vibrations of my father's viola, how I could feel the notes on my skin, even after he stopped playing, and I was in bed, listening only to the silence. I remember the inky smell of my school books as I cracked their spines, the sound of Frau Fessler's ruler smashing into my desk when she caught me with a book on my lap during math class, the way the fruit gummies from Vices got stuck in my back teeth, so I had to pick them out with my fingernails. I remember the damp heat of Annalisa's hand as she folded it with mine for the last time. I remember our neighbors' long coats decorated with flocks of badges saying only, "Ja." The swastikas on every armband and flag, pinned to every lapel, painted on our sidewalks. They even fell from the sky, flurries of paper spiders dropping onto our heads. I remember the newspapers my parents hid from me under sofa cushions. I remember lying awake, twisting the satiny border of my blanket in my fingers until my mother came and curled around me. I remember her breath on my neck, the ice of her fingers on my spine, stroking my skin until I drifted into dreams. The bland quotidian details, the textures of ordinary days, seared themselves most permanently, except for Annalisa. Annalisa, who was neither bland nor ordinary. Annalisa, who was more part of me than not. Our mothers had birthed us in the same building a week apart, and from then on, there were no divisions between us. The 4 syllables of her name were my first song.
That's wonderful. I was listening and counting, and it's such a feast for the senses. I mean, I think every single like touch, taste, smell, everything is there, right there at the beginning, and then you carry that on throughout the whole book. And that wonderful sinister turn at the end with the swastikas. You think, oh, this is nice. This is, and suddenly, oh god, it's a stunning, stunning. I love it. I love it.
The first line, when I think of Austria, I remember what a child remembers, comes from this now 88 or 89-year-old survivor I met in La Paz, who he fled Vienna when he was 8 years old and came to La Paz. And I interviewed him several times, and he told me a lot about his story. And he learned Spanish from his landlady's children, which is how Orly learned Spanish from Miguel. So I stole that from him. And I stole the opening line from him because I said, you know, when I asked him what he remembered about Austria, he said, "When I think of Austria, I remember what a child remembers." And he said it in this dismissive way, as if what a child remembers isn't worth very much.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and somehow I get away from that line. So,
Right. Oh, love it. Love it.
so Alex, do you want to give us a brief introduction to the Paris Hours and read us a little?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be thrilled. So the Paris Hours is set, perhaps unsurprisingly, in Paris, and it takes place over the course of one day in 1927. And it's really it's a novel, but it's really four separate stories, four different characters that sort of, and the stories cross-pollinate each other as the day goes on. We see the day in chronological order. And these four characters go on with their lives, and then they all converge at the end. And of the four characters one of them is called Guillaume, and he is a painter, I suspect a not especially good painter, who is suffering from unrequited love and also running from some thugs to whom he owes money. There's an ill-advised loan that he took out and now can't repay. Then there is Jean-Paul, who is a writer. He's a journalist, in fact, although he has also written a book. But he's a journalist because he finds it easier to tell other people's stories than to confront the tragedy that he is facing in his past. Then there is an Armenian refugee whose name is Soren, who is a puppeteer, and he, when he was 17, he escaped from the Armenian genocide, came to Paris, and he makes his living from performing puppet shows in the public parks in Paris, but he performs them in Armenian and not in French. And finally, there is Camille, who is the maid of Marcel Proust, the famous writer. And the book really began with her. Because I was reading the memoir of Celeste Albaret, which is the name of Proust's actual maid, and she wrote a wonderful book just called Monsieur Proust. And in that book, she tells the story, and we were talking about this just before we went live. She tells this story of being asked to burn 32 notebooks that Proust had written, and they contain the bones of In Search of Lost Time. And she burned them, and that was fine. She was utterly devoted to Proust and did anything that he asked her to do. But I was there going, "Oh no, she didn't. That's terrible." And it set off my novelist brain. I always say that novelists are like magpies. We're always looking around, looking for bright, shiny objects that we can pick up and hoard and then use in our stories later on. And that was one of those times when I thought, well, I have to, I could write about that. That's a really interesting thing, of burning all of those books. And then one part of that whole magpie thing is asking yourself, well, what if? And so the first question that I came up with was, well, what if she didn't burn them all? And what if she actually kept one of them back from the fire? And then the second question sort of trotted along after that, which was, well, what if there was something in that notebook, a secret that everybody thought had been destroyed, but actually hadn't been destroyed? And so from that sort of tiny little seed, this whole book arrived. So that's I always say, if that's an elevator pitch, it better be a very, very tall building or a very slow elevator. But and I will read a tiny bit. One of the problems, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, Jennifer, like when you have to read or you're asked to read, it's always hard because you never, you got a whole book to choose from, and choosing one bit is never easy. And I discovered it's particularly difficult when you have four main characters, because you sort of tend to favor one over all of the others. But oh well, the other three are just going to have to lump it. So this is the first time that we meet Jean-Paul, and I've chosen it I mean, it's a piece that I read a lot, but also because it does concern music, and I'm fairly confident that we're going to be talking quite a lot about music during this discussion. So this seemed like a good place to start. So the title of this chapter is Rhapsody, for reasons that will quickly become apparent. Jean-Paul Maillard closes his eyes and dreams of America. The needle touches the spinning vinyl with the gentlest sigh of static. He listens, spellbound. That clarinet, the first low trill fat with promise, and then the solo ascent to the heavens, soaring smoothly through the registers. By the time that ecstatic high note, limpid and beautiful, pours into his ears, Jean-Paul has made his escape. He sweeps through the open window onto Rue Barbette and hurtles down the cobbled streets of the Marais, streaking westward across the city. In a moment, he is flying over the dark waters of the Atlantic. The music beckons him on. He soars high over the city's skyscrapered silhouette, his for the taking. He hears the rumble of the Harlem-bound A train in the orchestra's propulsive rhythms, low and sweet. He hears new worlds in the piano's blistering, arpeggiated attacks. Images streak past like the onrushing traffic hurtling down the arrow straight avenues. Perfect lines of shimmying, high-kicking chorus girls, their cherry red lips glistening in the spotlights. A liveried doorman striding onto the busy street, his hand outstretched for a yellow cab. Elegant matrons pushing through the door at Bergdorf's. Sharp-dressed men with two-tone shoes, hats pulled down low, huddled close on a street corner. When Jean-Paul Maillard dreams of America, he dreams of New York City. But those dazzling syncopations do not last forever. The music ends and the spell is broken. Reluctantly, Jean-Paul opens his eyes. America has retreated, as it always does, and his shabby French apartment remains. He looks around. The place used to be so bright and tidy, so clean. Now every surface is coated with a patina of ancient dust. The wallpaper is staging a slow escape from the walls. A dark brown stain has annexed a corner of the ceiling. The gramophone is still going around. The silence is gently punctuated by the soft rhythmic bump of the needle against the spinning vinyl, as regular as a tiny heartbeat. He does not get up to switch it off. He likes the sound. Jean-Paul looks at the dim morning light creeping across the apartment window. It's been years since he has slept through the night. In the early hours of every morning, his ruined leg drags him from sleep. And then he sits in his armchair, listens to George Gershwin, and thinks about the lights of Manhattan.
I love that section. And I love that you chose to read that section. And it reminded me that when I was reading that section, I love that the way you described the piece, I knew what piece of music it was before you told me, because the way you described it was so perfect. It was so easy, you know, I could identify the piece of music before you told us that it was Gershwin. And I love that. And I love that that sound also reminds me of New York, and I lived on the A train, which I have a great fondness for. Um, so, you know, I also feel like as someone who lives in a permanent state of nostalgia for places I've lived, you know, I've related to a lot of these characters who are between cultures
Right.
in various ways.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, the music, I mean, you know, I wasn't going to start with the music, but we can talk about, I mean, there is something about Rhapsody in Blue that the genius of it in my mind is how evocative it is of New York. I don't know whether that was what Gershwin intended to do or not, but that's certainly what it does to me. And of course, all of music is, and when I mean, there's such an interesting challenge when we write about music, because you know it's how do you do that effectively? All you can do is use metaphor and imagery, but it's always a high wire act, it seems to me, because it's always so personal, and sort of I might hear that, but who knows what the next person does. So, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, the title of your book is a bit of a giveaway since it's called Exile Music. So it runs through your book. I mean, and both of Orly's parents are musicians. Her father, of course, plays viola, and her mother is a singer. But when they escape to Bolivia, only one of them manages to continue with the music making. And I found that such an interesting move on your part. And I wonder whether you could speak a little bit about why you did that and yeah, well, just why you did that. It was so interesting to me.
Well, music for my characters is like breathing. They've grown up with music. They think in music. Orly's parents, their marriage is founded on music because the mother's an opera singer, the father plays viola. So their whole relationship began with music, and is rooted in that. And so music is how my characters, well, two of them, Orly and her father, is what they use to adapt to their new surroundings. It's the only thing that they still have in La Paz. It's the way that they connect their lives in Austria to their lives in Bolivia. So Orly's father is unable to stop playing the viola. It's a part of his body. He can't stop playing. That's his coping mechanism. It's his drug. It's his everything. And it also allows him entry into the Bolivian culture because he starts to have Bolivian students, and in interacting with his students, he learns more about Bolivian music and music from elsewhere in South America. And he has a freedom that he never had. He learns that he has a creative freedom that he didn't have in the Vienna Philharmonic. There's other kinds of music out there that he's never played. And so he also becomes a student again in a way.
Mhm.
But music is the way he connects to Bolivia. And then he eventually connects with other refugees and forms an orchestra. And there was actually an orchestra formed in 1945 by Eric Eisner, who had spent time in Dachau and ended up the conductor of this orchestra in La Paz, Bolivia, which was founded in 1945. So that's the father, and Orly picks up a Bolivian instrument, and music is one of the ways. She also uses poetry to connect her past to her present. I think a lot about how the arts can help us move forward through trauma and grief, and they're a lifeline. They're a rope that characters can climb out, maybe not out of despair, but at least through it.
Sure. Yeah, and
So yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
I just have so much to say. Yeah, and it was interesting to me that Orly didn't pick up a Western, for want of a better word, a European instrument, and that she did choose something that was sort of native to Bolivia, which speaks to a larger theme about her and her relationship with where she came from and where she is now, and that was lovely. Are you a musician yourself?
I'm not. I wish I were a musician, which is why I wrote about them. I tend to only write about characters who do things I wish I could do. So my last novel was a visual artist because I wish I could, draw or paint, which I can't do that either. My talents are limited. And I wish I could compose music. I wish I could play music. And so I loved the research. Also, I wanted to pick something I would love researching. And
Oh, sure.
researching this, was engrossing. I read biographies of Mahler, and then of course Mahler's wife Alma novels have been written about her. I mean, she's a fascinating person. And then all the music and that there was to research, not just the opera of the time and the Vienna Philharmonic, but the popular music of the day that Orly would have heard growing up. So there was a lot of research there, and also the history of the Vienna Philharmonic is horrific.
Yeah, you mentioned this. So tell us a little bit about. I mean, maybe we don't want to hear, but tell us about that.
Well, this is something that I had been unaware of before I started research, and there have been things written about it now, but mostly in German, and I'm not sure how much has actually been written in English. But the Vienna Philharmonic sent all their Jewish musicians either to death or exile. All of them. They just expelled them all. Most of them died in concentration camps or elsewhere, or as a result of their exile. And I wanted their names to be preserved. It was important to me that their names be someplace, because a lot of these musicians, they don't even know where their bodies are, their ashes are. They don't know what happened to them in the end. And there were still, the Vienna Philharmonic continued to employ Nazis until 1967. And I found this shocking. And that I was imagining also what Orly's father must have felt as a Jewish musician playing in the orchestra, to be sitting next to someone who wanted him dead.
Mhm.
What was that like to play music with someone who wanted you dead? I I just was, because that was the situation they were in. There were members, even when the Nazi Party was not legal, it was illegal in Austria, before Germany and, before the Anschluss. And there were still Nazis, a large number of Nazis in the orchestra. So, and they also have a horrific history in terms of employing women and anyone who isn't white and man. So it's just a terrible history. And I wanted to talk about that as well. And it was, I was really nervous. I showed the early drafts to musicians and composers, because I really was nervous about making mistakes. And also, I recently, Benjamin Zander, the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra, he just read it last weekend, actually. And I was really nervous that he'd find mistakes, but he said he put his entire life on hold to finish reading this book and was really drawn into the world. And to me, that was the nicest thing I could have heard about the musical aspect of that book. That someone who is as an accomplished a musician as he is could not,
Well, you did such a wonderful job of, as you said at the beginning, it's like breathing to them, and that came across so clearly, which made the fact that when you talked about Orly's father, but not so much about her mother, but the fact that she doesn't sing anymore. This woman with this beautiful voice and passion is just, awful to read. And it was and I think I guess the comparison of the two made her loss, made us feel, the reader feel the loss all the more. So that was wonderful. So what is it about Mahler, and these six movements of the Third Symphony?
Well, Mahler played such a large role in Vienna in that time. He loomed large on the music scene, and I felt that Orly's father would have perhaps worked briefly with him.
Mhm.
They would have overlapped, and he was Jewish, and although a complicated way of being Jewish, so I was attracted by that. And it's funny, when I began researching him was so many years ago now. It's sometimes hard to go back to that to when you first began researching someone. I did research other composers of the time. I don't know, maybe it's because I had this childhood obsession with Alma. I don't know if you know the Tom Lehrer song, like the Ballad of Alma, which is this satirical song about Alma and how she managed to marry or seduce most of the creative men in Europe. And I was,
That sounds like Tom Lehrer.
yeah. Um, but I think, you mentioned Orly's mother, and I think her rejection of music is why she can't adapt to Bolivia. She has nothing to hold on to.
Right.
She's
Yes.
she
Yeah.
Yeah. But along those lines, just in terms of art helping us survive, one of I think my favorite character in the Paris Hours is Sorin, the Armenian puppeteer. I loved him from the start, and I still find it difficult to talk about him without weeping. But the way he describes his puppets, and the care he takes with making their clothes every single day. And I just happened to have recently seen a puppet maker craft puppets and go through that. And so I had this, and just to hear you, just to see you describe it. And I wonder, did you think about how, like, did you see that as one way that Soren was able to kind of function in the world was by those puppets, like that is his art form, his way of moving through his grief and loss? And
Absolutely. I mean, he, I haven't delved too deep into the uh, the metaphor, the potential of metaphor for all of that, because he's when he does these puppet shows, he's hiding behind a screen, so he can't be seen, but these extensions on the ends of his hands can be seen, and the fact that he speaks in Armenian, and when he's doing these puppet shows. But yes, I mean that's how he expresses himself. Nobody, he doesn't have very many friends, but what he does is seen by hundreds of people every day. So there's this strange dichotomy between the sort of the intensely personal interior, and then there is this aspect that is that is on display. And I think that one of the things that I had fun with was, he tells these stories that are they're sort of based in folk tales and myths, but he gives a twist to them. And what the person I was thinking of when I was sort of writing about that was Roald Dahl, who took real delight, I think, in making his characters really mean, and then,
Yeah.
and then come to terrible ends.
Yeah.
There was no Disneyfication of any of his stories. Like, this is a really nasty person, and guess what? Her head got bitten off, or whatever it was. So, that always appealed to me. And the thing is, it always appealed to children. The reason why Roald Dahl is so popular is because he's like an antidote to all of the sort of sermonizing. Well, if you act nicely, you'll like all that stuff.
Mhm.
So and so when I was writing it, I was sort of writing towards that, I suppose, and just and and the children, when I sort of describe the children, they love it. They love this stuff. They love the violence. They love all the, because, and obviously they didn't have, this was 1927, so they weren't sort of watching anything on TV or anything, but they, there's and in England, there is this very bizarre tradition called Punch and Judy, which, if I were to go into the details of it, I mean, it's so peculiar. The protagonist is this puppet called Punch who beats his wife. I mean, and there's a crocodile that eats sausages, and these weird sort of pantomime tropes, which I guess are very English, although I hesitate to say that because I feel like I'm tarring my entire my homeland with that statement. But anyway, it's really super weird. And of course, the French have their own traditions with puppetry, and there is, I mean, it's just such a rich vein to tap into. And he discovered puppets. Soren discovered puppets after he had left, after he was fleeing the refugee, quite by chance. And what he found was that it was a way of telling stories. And we all need to tell stories. And this was how he did it. He was not able, because he didn't speak the language at the time, to tell a story in any sort of regular way. But when he had, I'm doing this because I'm imagining there's a puppet on the end of my hand. When he had a puppet on his hand, he was able to do that. And it was a liberation for him to be able to do that. So it was super fun to sort of explore that whole thing. And I'm now going to segue very smoothly, like I planned it, into the questions that I was going to ask you at the beginning before we got derailed by the music stuff. Although, one more thing about music, I was talking about this recently and was reminded of a really terrific line that Thelonious Monk once said, which was, writing about music is like dancing to architecture, or dancing about architecture, which I think is wonderful, and I think it speaks to the difficulties that we face, when we write about music. And I realize as I say that there's not really any question at the end of that. So I just wanted to share that the dancing about architecture, because it is these two different modes of artistic expression, and sort of they meet in all sorts of weird places. And actually, I'm now going to change tack again if I can, because there's a bit towards the end of your book when Orly talks about writing poems as opposed to writing stories. and I'm just thinking about different artistic modes and how we can convey certain truths by them. And she says, I wonder if I wrote it down. She says, yes, the poems, they told the truth. And I wonder if you could, what's the difference? I mean, for you, obviously everyone's different, but the difference between telling a story as a story and telling a story in a poem, and why do poems hold more truth?
Yeah, that's a good question, especially because I'm not a poet, at least not in public. Uh, but I mean, Orly started writing poetry. It started with an exercise in one of her first classes as a child in Bolivia, where her writing teacher said to her, "Pick two things that have nothing in common." And so she picked these two things that have nothing in common, and then the poetry teacher says, "Now I want you to write the connection." And so poetry becomes this bridge between those two things, and this becomes kind of a metaphor for the book and the way Orly connects her old world to her past. Um, but I think, recently I was working on a poem that I was really struggling with, and I talked to a poet friend of mine, and I said, "How do you edit your poems? How do you edit them?" And she said, "It's a process with poetry. It's different from fiction in that it's simply a process of removal, of kind of removing everything
Mhm.
down to just the bones, or just the truth, um or just the breath. So, you kind of include as little as possible." um so I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I think for Orly, I think, all right, so this particular poem that I was trying to write was about, so several of my closest friends have lost children, and at a very young age. And I had just been to the funeral of an 8-year-old, and anyone who's ever been to the funeral of an 8-year-old, it's something that you'll never be the same after. And because writing's how I process everything, I was trying to process my grieving friend and the death of this child, and I couldn't write it in any other way except a poem, because any other way felt like I was trying to put too much sense in something that actually makes no sense, or something that was too painful to put in any other form but a poem. And I'm just kind of talking here. I'm not sure how much sense I'm making,
No,
but
that makes complete sense to me. I mean, I'm not a poet either. I know lots of poets, but
mhm.
and I'm always astonished, and I love reading poetry, and it's always a source of astonishment, how I mean, and I love the thing about it's a process of removal until all that's left is the truth. I mean, yes, that's right, and that to me that kind of answers the question about all these and her thing, because but the way that the poems, these extraordinarily economical, um, just a few lines can pack such a phenomenal punch emotionally, and that is truly a marvel when it's done well. That's really interesting.
Can I make one comment, just going back to your puppets for a minute, if you don't mind?
Yeah, yeah, of course.
Um, and you're talking about Roald Dahl, and I absolutely get all of that. We actually went to the Roald Dahl Museum when we were living in England, so spent some time there. But also fairy tales, they are the most gruesome,
Oh,
horrible things you could imagine,
yeah,
and we read them to kids.
yeah.
Um,
Well, and you're talking of fairy tales. So, and oh, what's her name? Naira. How do you pronounce
Naira, yeah,
Naira?
Naira.
So the some of the stories that she told Orly were very dark, and in a kind of wonderful way, in that same way, and that was a wonderful, felt like a line in the sand, and so one of the ways in which, yeah, things are different down here than they are. So, and those stories are just one example of stories throughout the book. So all he says, I was starting to suspect that a person's value to me had always depended largely on her ability to tell me stories, which was a clue. And yeah, there are stories everywhere, because we start at the beginning with Orly and Annalisa telling these stories about their bunnies. And then you could say that, her father, when he plays his viola, is always telling a story. And I just, and I wondered if you could talk about the sort of the important, I mean, it sounds like a funny thing to ask a novelist, but the importance of stories to you.
Yeah, I mean, that makes complete sense, because that was one of the kernels of this book, was this imaginary world that Orly created with her friend Annalisa. And I had imagined that a child growing up in Austria at that time, a Jewish child growing up in Austria at that time, and feeling the approaching menace and the fact that the adults were all talking about incredibly scary things that you didn't quite understand, you would need an imaginary world. You would need somewhere else to go. And that's what she created with Annalisa. And that came from, and this kind of goes back to why I decided to tell the story, starting when Orly was a child, although she's in her 40s when the book ends, but was when my daughter was around 4 and we were living in Bolivia. She asked me, where did I live before Bolivia? She couldn't remember. And I said, well, you lived in London. And she said, before that. And I said, Jordan. Before that, Yemen. Before Yemen, I said, you lived in my belly. And she said, no, before I lived in your belly. And I said, well, you didn't exist before then. And she said, I existed in bunny belts, and there was a mama bunny, and she started creating this whole world, which she then continued to create for 7 years. And it was very complex, and everyone was a vegetarian, and the president was a hermaphrodite, so they could be equally male and female. And there was a geography. She drew maps. We had visitors from bunny belts. So I mean, it became a big part of our lives. And so I said, this was going on when I started writing this book. And I was thinking, well, a little girl would need this world to retreat into. And it's not as interesting if she just does it alone. So it allowed her to connect with Annalisa, and they had that world together. And that was kind of the start of their bond. But also her bond with Naira, who's Aymara in La Paz. Naira tells her Aymara myths. She grew up near Lake Titicaca, and so they connect through those myths. And so it goes back to that quote you mentioned about people telling stories. Kind of almost all her relationships are centered on stories. And I guess that's another way we make sense of trauma and grief. And
right, it is, and it's the glue that pulls these people together. And it's interesting though, because with Naira they're telling each other stories, but with Annalisa there's this collaborative element, and they create them together, and it's a different bond. You can see it's a different bond,
yeah,
which is super interesting. So you also wrote to me when you sent me an email, and I this was sort of really interesting to me. And you said, I considered writing a non-fiction book, but I thought I could more easily grasp truth via fiction, which reminded me of a very famous Stephen King aphorism, and he's got a few, but that said, fiction is the truth inside the lie. And I write books, so I feel I know exactly what you're talking about. But I wonder if you could explain a little bit about that thought, and about how sometimes we can reach the truth through telling a lie and through making up stories.
Yeah. So I considered writing it as nonfiction because my background is as a I was a journalist before I was a novelist. And so I thought, well, could I write this as nonfiction? But then I'd have to pick a survivor's story to tell. And most of the survivors are dead, and quite difficult to find. And although I found some, and I found a lot more since the book came out, because they all write to me now. But
Yeah.
but I think if I told one of their stories, there would have been holes. It would have been hard to get the whole of their life. I wanted to be able to write about how they cooked and what they ate, and the streets they walked down. And in reading memoirs, I was always frustrated by the details they left out about their daily life. And people leave out things that are of interest, things like, what did their oven look like? And could they get butter? And what kind of produce was growing locally, and what kind of music was there, and did they have electricity, and all those things. And I just thought, if I wanted to create a world, a context that was as believable as possible and well researched, and that people would recognize who'd been through it. But I thought, in terms of the characters, I wanted to be able to shape a story that would affect people emotionally. And I wasn't sure that I'd be able to mold real people as easily. I mean, their stories are fascinating, but I just felt like there'd be too many gaps in what I knew about their lives. I'd be constricted to telling only what I knew, only what they remember.
That makes total sense. That there's a great story that I sometimes tell about Jan Martel, who wrote Life of Pi, which, for those people who haven't read it, is a story basically, in the most basic terms, of a boy in a boat with a tiger. Yeah, it's a wonderful book. And there's a story that Jan Martel was at a reading in a bookstore, and they came to the Q&A, and someone put up their hand and said, Mr. Martel, is this story true? To which Jan Martel said, oh, absolutely, it's true. And then he paused, and then he said, I mean, it's not factually true, but it's emotionally true. And when I heard that, the big light bulb went off, and I went, that's the key, is that as you said, the emotional resonance of the story, that's what makes a story true. You got to believe it. The reader has to believe it, has to inhabit this world that you've created for them, without sort of going. So there's another story about Martin Amos's father, Kingsley Amos, who was also wonderful, but very, very grumpy writer. And there's a story about him reading a book, which Martin Amos tells, and he was just there going, no, she didn't. No, he wouldn't. No, he didn't. And just basically just saying, he just didn't believe a word he was reading. So that truth, that emotional truth, that's so important. And one of the discussions, and I wanted to ask you about this, that I have a lot with people who write historical fiction in particular, is how about fealty to truth, fealty to facts, as opposed to that emotional truth, and where do you draw the line? And I think every writer has a sort of tolerance, and it's in different places depending on who they are. And I know certain people who every little detail, even though they're writing a novel, every little detail has to be correct. So they would go and check what the weather was on this particular day, and so on and so forth. And then there are other people who really don't care at all. They just want to tell a great story. And I'm just curious where you fall on that spectrum.
So I hope you'll answer this question too, by the way, because I have so many questions too. But yeah, so I researched the hell out of this book, really, because I was terrified someone was going to catch me out on a mistake, and I wanted to get that context exactly right. I could make my characters any way I wanted to, I could. But I mean, even things like the kind of soprano that the mother was in an early draft, a friend of mine who read it said, no, the mother would not sing these two roles you have her singing. Those are two different kinds of soprano. She would only, and I was like, there's more than one kind. I mean, I knew there was more than one kind, but I hadn't realized those two roles were not something the same singer would do. So I did that. And in terms of Orly, also kind of in the way she comes to grips with her sexuality, she's drawn to girls, is I read all the books that I thought she might have read in the 20s and 30s. So I looked for books that came out in Germany and Austria in the 1920s and 30s. And I read those because those are the books Orly might have had access to. And that kind of gave me access to her inner life, I hope, and allowed her to discover other things kind of through that. But, I researched the music. I watched videos on YouTube about how to cook on a kerosene stove, because that's what they would have used. And cooking at altitude, I mean, I did ridiculous, you spend hours figuring out what did they wear? And, they didn't sell clothing in La Paz at the time. There were dress patterns circulating that people would share with each other, and, and all those kind of details. But anyway, I'm curious, Alex, where you fall as well, because there's such a blend of, you have a lot of actual famous people in your book. You know, you have Hemingway, you have Josephine Baker, you have Proust. So you've got all these real people, and everything you wrote about them, you know, did you play around with that? Did you have
Yeah,
fun with them?
I mean, I always look at all this stuff. I'm in like in a defensive mode, and rather, as you said, I don't want anyone calling me up or writing me a nasty email going, "Well, you got that wrong," which they will. And there's in one of my earlier books, I had a guy coming out of a restaurant in London and walking down a street in Soho, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I wrote, he felt the heat of the sun on the back of his neck. I got a letter from someone saying, if, as you allege, he was walking down that street at that time of day, the sun would have been in his face. And I just thought, wow, someone has way too much time on their hands. So,
Yeah.
so you know, if you make a mistake, the one thing you can be sure of is that somebody will point it out. So I wanted to avoid doing that, and so I sometimes think about my novels as a thread that is superimposed on a tapestry that is already there. And so you can't free, and it has to, as the thread goes into the tapestry, it's got to blend in with the background. So you can't change things just because it's more convenient. You can't have World War One ending in 1919 because that suits your, you know, your story better. You know, you have to stick within these established parameters. It gets much more complicated when you're talking about specific individuals, and you know, who lived. And you know, I read obviously a ton about all of these people, and just did my best to sort of take in as much as I could by osmosis, and then just write to these characters. And I always think that, you know, as novelists, when you're talking, and because you have Klaus Barbie in your book, which I thought was a tremendously bold and brilliant move, and I want to ask you about that. But you know, so for example, you mentioned Hemingway and Gertrude Stein is there. There's a scene where they are squabbling in Shakespeare and Company one afternoon, and by 1927, the two of them really couldn't stand each other. There were these two egos which were too big. They loved each other a few years previously, and by then they was like couldn't stand each other because they were both jealous of each other's success. And now, did they have the conversation that appears in the book? No, of course they didn't. I made it up. But could they have? Absolutely. So, you know, I think that novelists exist in this sort of there's this, we find these lacunae and then of possibility, and then we can inhabit those. And a wonderful example of that is a great book by a friend of mine who's a wonderful writer called Christopher Castellani, and he wrote a book called Leading Men. And it's all about one summer, I think it's 1956, when Tennessee Williams is in Italy with his lover, and no one knows what happened during that time. And so Chris told the story. He made it up, and he was able to do so because there's no information. No one can contradict him. So that's always been my approach. Like, read enough, know enough to know that you're not making any grotesque misrepresentations or errors, and then within that those parameters, then you know you give, you know, you have to, I mean, give them your own voice and you know, animate them however you will. So that's kind of the way I've always done it.
I love that idea of writing. You know, I feel like we're kind of constantly living in between land as writers. You know, you're in that space, like filling that gap in Tennessee Williams' biography. Or you find those gaps and fill them in.
Yeah.
What you think could have been there,
Yeah.
and that's I'm drawn to spaces between things. So, you know, gaps in things. You know. And you know, a lot of your characters as well are balancing between cultures, and you know, you know, I have to keep going back to the Armenian. I'm sorry, because I really love him. So can you tell me how did his story get started for you? How did you decide to include him?
So
And
yeah, so I mentioned about magpies before. So a similar sort of magpie moment. So I have a good friend of mine, who I used to work with in a law firm in London. He was my shadow, I guess. I was supervising him, and he was called Rafi Varugian, which is about as Armenian a name as you can have. And Rafi and I suffer from a similar affliction, which is a lifelong devotion to Arsenal Football Club. And when we lived in London, we both had season tickets, and we would go and watch this team usually get beaten by some other team. And it was all very painful, but we'll push past that. Before the games, we would meet up in a pub and have a pint of beer before we walked to the stadium. And, you know, out of a work context, that was really where our friendship blossomed. And that was where we were able to talk about things other than work. And he told me about the Armenian genocide. And I was appalled for two very different reasons. I was appalled because it's appalling. I mean, the atrocities that were committed in 1915 are just, I mean, just beyond belief. But I was also appalled by the fact that I had never heard about it. And that, you know, I was hearing this information for the first time. And I thought at the time, gosh, well, I'd really like to write about that one day. But, you know, so that was that was me being a magpie. And so I just put it in my back pocket. And, you know, I wrote 3 or 4 books in between that drink in the pub and the Paris hours. And when I finally settled on telling a story in 1927 in Paris, I suddenly thought, this is my opportunity. And it was that way round. It was, you know, I think there's always a danger when you've got a really good idea, you try and shoehorn it into something. And it usually shows when you do that. So it has to sort of flow organically. But I was already sort of in Paris in my head in 1927. And I suddenly thought, this is my chance to tell this story. And, you know, as novelists, we have this extraordinary privilege to be able to shine, you know, a very small light on some things that we would like people to know about. Just as with your story, I had no idea about this exodus to Bolivia. And so that was an opportunity to do that. Now it's a scary thing to do because this is not, you know, these are serious matters, and the worry always is that you honor the story and the people, the real life people whose story it is. And Rafi has read the book, and I'm extremely relieved to tell you that he approves and says that I did okay. And in fact, I've received lots and lots of correspondence from people of Armenian descent thanking me for telling this story, because, you know, it's not a story that is told nearly often enough. And I know that on April the 23rd, Joe Biden actually on the anniversary of the genocide did actually address it, and thank heavens for that, but it's too little too late.
Yes. Yeah. I through the AWP, I mentored a writer who is Armenian American, and she wrote a book that's set in World War II that deals with Armenians. And so Armenians have been kind of on my mind a lot because of her and that. And then I encountered it in your book, and I wrote to her. I remember the second I opened your book and it was like, there was an Armenian. I was like, oh, I have to write to Olivia. And so, yeah, that, I mean, I hope that light continues to be shown into that dark story.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So I think unless we seem to be running out of time, and so I don't know if anyone has any questions for Alex.
No? Belmont Books back in the chat. If you any participant questions, I mean, it's been just such a joy to hear the two of you in conversation. Just such a like fruitful and creative talk, and I feel like I've learned so much more about your processes and about the like stories and narratives that have inspired you. So yeah, any last call for any questions from the
I mean, I've got pages of them.
I know.
I did get the feeling that you were kind of just getting started. I feel like we could be having this conversation all night.
We did say sort of, you know, we both tend to over prepare for this kind of.
Yeah. I know I've got so many questions I haven't got, but that's the way it always goes, I guess.
Of course.
So much to say.
Yeah, it's like as I said, it's, I mean, what a joy, and thank you both so much for for your time and for the care and love that you've put into this. And okay, so we do have a question.
Oh.
So maybe this might be this might be a dark note to end on. So Anne would like to ask Jennifer about how much real life sublimation of pain through art maybe is related to your career as a journalist, or how.
I mean, that's interesting. Just, I'll be brief, but so my previous book, The Ambassador's Wife, was inspired by, so when I was 6.5 months pregnant with my daughter, I was kidnapped in Yemen by eight men with 8 AK-47s. And that scene, the kidnapping happened kind of the way it does in that book, although the rest of the book is complete fiction. That was just my starting point. And it was kind of what Alex says about what ifs. Like I thought, well, what if I hadn't been released? What if I'd been kept? And I proceeded from there. And so I thought, having written that scene, I was done with that episode, but I seem to keep writing it. I write about that kidnapping once a month at least. And kind of it gets narrower and narrower. Like I think I'm trying to shrink the experience by writing briefer pieces. And because basically in super brief, I started going to premature labor and realized that if I freaked out, I was going to lose my daughter. And so I had to not freak out. So I did yoga breathing to calm down. And it really was about breath. It really came down to breath, because I thought, I'm the only one who can control this. I have got to calm down. I cannot freak out or I will lose her. I might lose her anyway. They might shoot us. But if they don't shoot us, I want to make sure I'm not giving birth prematurely in the middle of the mountains of Yemen. So sorry, that's a brief version of this.
There's not much to follow that way.
Indescribable. Well, let's ask one last question. I mean, yeah, Jennifer, thank you for sharing. Oh man. So let's end on one last question from Marie, which is for both of you to ask, what surprises you when you write?
Alex, you start.
What surprises me? I'm always surprised when I write something that I quite like. I mean, most writers are hypercritical to a fault, and I'm certainly like that. And it's just nice to write something and then look at it the next day and go, oh, that was all right. Actually, that wasn't too bad. But more generally, writers fall into several categories, but people who plan everything out, and then people who write organically, which is I think a charitable way of just saying they're just chaotic and don't really know what they're doing. And that's me. And so, without a firm plan in mind, I just write to see what's going to happen next. And so inevitably you get surprised because things happen that you sort of, and still to this day, things happen in my books. And people very often, I did a book group on Monday and someone said, why did you do that? And I just had to say, I have absolutely no idea. It just happened, and people look at you funny. They go, why aren't you telling it? But it's true. Sometimes you're not aware of why things happen. It might be gut. It might, who on earth knows? So that's always fun, to not be so sort of hemmed in by the parameters of the story, that you have that ability to surprise yourself.
I think we have the same writing process. I mean, it's deep. I mean, it feels like deeply inefficient because, but I end up writing like a million times more than I ever need, because yeah, the discovery for me is in the writing. The discovery happens in the writing. If I were to sit down and write an outline, I would then have no interest in writing the book. I need to be writing in order to discover things. And I guess what surprises me is, especially when I write dialogue, I feel like I'm listening to a conversation that I'm not part of. Like I'm just listening to these characters talk and writing their words down. And I hate to use the word channeling because I don't feel like, I'm not mystical about it or anything like that. But it does happen for me only in the writing. There is something about the act of writing that is where a story is created. And so the first draft happens that way, and all the art happens in the 97th draft,
Yeah, I think it's interesting you talk about dialogue. I mean, I sometimes say, you know, if I don't know what to write, then I'll just put two people in a room and have them start talking. And then, you know, then they're going to say something. It might be incredibly dull. It might be funny. It might, yeah, who knows? But they're going to say something, and then you can. It's usually something that you can run with. So, and just very briefly, so anecdotally, Michael Ondaatje, when he began The English Patient, he's like us, by the way, Jennifer.
Oh, good. I feel so much better.
We're in good company. But when he began The English Patient, all he knew, or the only thing he knew, was that there was a soldier in a bed whose face was covered with bandages, and that was how he began. And he wanted to find out what happened next. So then he started writing the story. So, you know, and that seemed to go okay.
He hasn't done badly.
No, I think shows promise.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both again so much. I think like we have the links to purchase Exile Music and the Paris Hours in the chat. Thank you all for being here, for supporting Belmont Books, or an independent bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. We, you know, we're so grateful for the community and for authors like you who really keep the world of bookselling as fun as it is. So,
Thank you for having us, and thank you, Alex, for doing this with me. I really appreciate it.
Of course, it was.
And thank you for your book, which I love. I have 2 copies, so.
Oh, goodness. We did twice. All right, thank you very much. That was so much fun.
thanks.
Yeah,
Everyone.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.